The air inside Hargrave Industries' executive boardroom always smelled of wealth, polished oak tables, leather chairs, and the faint aroma of imported cigars that clung to the CEO's tailored suits. For 6 years, I had sat at the far end of that table, the quiet yet indispensable force behind the company's most profitable venture, Project Synthesis. The secret of the project wasn't written in files or saved on drives. It lived in me, in the coded formulas and algorithms I had painstakingly developed, revised, and perfected. No one else in the company knew how the system truly worked. They knew only the results profits that soared year after year, investors who poured in money, and competitors who struggled to keep up. For 6 years, I believed loyalty meant security, until the day the betrayal came. Effective immediately, CEO Richard Hargrave declared, his voice carrying that smug finality of a man who thought he owned the room. We'll be restructuring the research division. Some roles will no longer be necessary. I felt the words sink like cold steel into my chest. He didn't meet my eyes, couldn't. Instead, he kept them on the papers in his hand, as though reading my erasure from existence. My erasure. He dismissed me with a smile that could cut glass. We appreciate your service. You'll receive a severance package. That was it. Years of sacrifice, late nights, the secret that made Hargrave Industries a titan, all dismissed with a calculated cruelty. The other executives shifted uncomfortably. They knew who I was. They knew what I had built. But none of them dared speak. Fear of Richard Hargrave's iron hand silenced them all. I walked out without a word. To them, it looked like compliance. To me, it was the first step in a much bigger plan. What Richard didn't know, couldn't know, was that Project Synthesis wasn't finished. The core algorithm he thought he controlled was incomplete. Only I had the missing key, the silent variable that made the system truly sustainable. Without it, the project would eat itself alive, and I had no intention of handing it over. Back at my small apartment, I pulled the blinds shut and powered on my private system. The screen lit up with lines of code, flowing like rivers of power across the black background. My creation, my leverage. Richard thought betrayal was a clean cut. He thought I would vanish quietly into the void, broken and humiliated. But betrayal is a dangerous thing. It awakens parts of you didn't know existed. And as the night stretched into morning, I realized something. This wasn't the end of my career. It was the beginning of Richard Hargrave's downfall. The trade secret wasn't just a formula. It was a weapon, and I was the only one who could wield it. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion battling with exhilaration. The city lights flickered outside, a reminder of the empire Richard believed he controlled. But soon, that empire would crumble. Because when you betray someone who holds the key to your entire kingdom, you don't just make an enemy. You create your executioner. And I was ready to begin. The first rule of revenge in the corporate world is patience. The second is precision. Richard Hargrave thought firing me had cut the last string of my influence. But the truth was simpler. I had spent years weaving myself into the company's veins. My departure didn't sever those ties. It only made them invisible. On my desk sat a stack of leather-bound notebooks. Each one was filled with details executives' habits, investors' insecurities, suppliers' pressure points, years of observation, written not for betrayal, but for survival. Now, they would become my arsenal. I started with the clients. Every major client of Hargrave Industries trusted me more than they trusted the board. They had grown used to my late night calls, my calm explanations of impossible problems, my ability to resolve crises in minutes when their own departments failed. Richard never understood that. He believed contracts and logos made loyalty. But loyalty doesn't live in paperwork. It lives in trust. I drafted carefully worded emails, personal enough to remind them of my value, vague enough not to alert the legal hounds Richard kept leashed in the office. I didn't sell myself as a savior yet. Instead, I planted seeds, subtle hints that the new team might not handle their projects with the same precision. It didn't take long. 2 days after sending the first messages, I received a call from one of the firm's largest accounts. "We're concerned," the client said. "Richard assures us everything is fine, but without you there, we're hesitant." A perfect doubt had begun to grow. While the client simmered, I moved on to the second phase, destabilization. I knew project synthesis like a parent knows a child, and I knew exactly how to bend it without breaking it. Just enough to cause glitches that couldn't be easily traced. The incomplete version Richard relied on was a ticking bomb. All it needed was a nudge. From my private terminal, I introduced microscopic shifts into the algorithm's predictive model. Not enough to crash the system, but enough to shake investor confidence. Projections dipped, then corrected, then dipped again. A rhythm of uncertainty that would gnaw at any boardroom's nerves. Within a week, Richard called an emergency investor meeting. I wasn't there, but I could imagine his face. That forced composure cracking around the edges, the sweat forming under his pristine collar. Investors didn't like unpredictability, and unpredictability was the one thing I could guarantee. Meanwhile, whispers spread. I had friends still inside, quiet allies who despised Richard's tyranny but feared open rebellion. They fed me updates, the board questioning Richard's decisions, department heads whispering about the missing piece of synthesis, murmurs that perhaps I had been dismissed too soon. Richard had wanted me erased. Instead, he had made me a myth, the ghost in the system, the name spoken in corridors with a mix of fear and respect. But revenge isn't complete with whispers and glitches. No, revenge requires spectacle, and I was ready for the spectacle. I began drafting proposals, polished, sharp, irresistible. Not to Hargrave Industries, but to its competitors, smaller firms hungering for growth, desperate for the edge that could dethrone a giant. What I offered them wasn't the entire synthesis system, but something more dangerous, a promise that I could deliver what Hargrave could not: stability, foresight, and control. Every proposal carried the same clause, hidden in the fine print. My full involvement was non-negotiable. No one else could execute it. No one else had the trade secret. Richard thought he owned me by owning my work. He never realized my work owned him. As I clicked send on the first proposal, a rush of adrenaline surged through me. This was no longer about survival. This was war. And war in the corporate world isn't fought with guns or bombs. It's fought with contracts, secrets, and silence sharp enough to cut steel. By the third week after my dismissal, Hargrave Industries no longer looked like the untouchable empire it had once been. The investors were restless, clients were unsettled, and rumors of instability leaked into the press. All this while Richard Hargrave paraded around, trying to convince the world, and himself, that everything was under control. Behind the curtains, however, the real control was shifting. To me, one by one, competitors began responding to my proposals. These were firms Richard had scoffed at for years, smaller, irrelevant companies in his eyes. But in business, irrelevance is only a temporary condition. All they needed was an advantage. I was that advantage. I met the first group of executives in a discreet hotel lounge, far from the gleaming towers of downtown. They came cautious but hungry, their eyes sharp with calculation. I laid out my terms with calm precision. You want to grow. You want Hargrave's market share. I can give you both. But I don't sell formulas. I sell stability, and stability requires me They didn't hesitate long. Contracts were drafted, signatures inked. My clauses were ironclad, full creative control, non-disclosure agreements that locked my methods in silence, and guarantees of profit, sharing that secured my future far beyond a paycheck. The next firm followed, then another. Soon, I was bound not to one empire, but to several, smaller kingdoms uniting under my unseen leadership. Meanwhile, Hargrave Industries' blood. The glitches I had seeded in synthesis began to compound. Forecasts skewed wildly, deliveries faltered, and clients grew more anxious. Several called Richard directly, demanding stability. He promised them solutions. But solutions never came, because the missing piece, my piece, wasn't in his hands. I still had allies inside, and their messages painted a delicious picture of Richard's unraveling. He had grown irritable, snapping at board members, lashing out in meetings. He called emergency sessions that produced nothing but more doubt. Investors wanted answers he couldn't give. Clients wanted reassurance he couldn't provide. Then came the first blow. One of Hargrave's oldest clients, a multinational firm that had fed them millions annually, announced it was shifting its account, not to another giant, but to one of the small companies Richard had always dismissed. The very company now tied to me. The announcement landed like a thunderclap in the industry press. Articles speculated about Hargrave's decline. Headlines questioned Richard's leadership, and analysts warned of systemic instability. Stock prices dipped. Shareholders panicked. I watched it all unfold from the quiet of my apartment, sipping coffee as though I were observing the weather. This was the storm I had built, and Richard was standing directly in its path. But I wasn't finished. I prepared the second strike, a contract clause buried deep within the agreements Richard had once forced upon me. Back when he thought he was clever, he had inserted predatory terms designed to trap employees. What he hadn't realized was that I had rewritten those clauses. Subtle language that, under certain conditions, reversed liability, conditions that now applied. With a single legal motion, I triggered a chain reaction. Hargrave Industries was suddenly bound by contracts they thought they controlled, but actually undermined them. The boardroom went into chaos, lawyers scrambling, executives whispering. Richard didn't just have a system glitch. He now had a legal nightmare. And all the while, more clients slipped through his fingers. Contracts redirected to the companies that had embraced me. For the first time in years, Richard Hargrave, the untouchable CEO, looked vulnerable. But I didn't want vulnerability. I wanted collapse. And as the empire buckled under pressure, I sharpened the final blade. Because betrayal isn't paid back in whispers. It's paid back in ruins. The louder the collapse became, the more desperate Richard grew. He had always thrived on power plays, on bullying board members, and silencing critics with his signature charm. But charm is useless when numbers spiral downward. Investors don't listen to words when stock prices scream the opposite. And Richard's empire was screaming. Hargrave Industries' headquarters turned into a fortress of panic. My sources inside painted a vivid picture. Emergency meetings stretching until dawn, legal departments combing through contracts, Richard pacing like a predator in a cage. He barked orders at subordinates, cursed at advisors, slammed his fist against polished oak tables. He knew someone was behind this. He just didn't know who. At least, not yet. The first counterstrike came swiftly. Richard launched a public campaign, speaking at press conferences with a practiced calm. He assured the world that Hargrave Industries was strong, that rumors of decline were exaggerated. He accused competitors of sabotage, hinting at conspiracies. But investors don't invest in speeches. They invest in results. And the results were undeniable. Clients were leaving. Algorithms were unstable. Contracts were turning against them. His public reassurance only made the cracks more visible. Then came the personal attack. Late one night, as I was reviewing new proposals from yet another competitor eager to tie their future to me, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered. Silence. Then a voice I knew too well. "You think you're clever," Richard said. His tone was calm, almost too calm. "But I know it's you. Who else could be behind this? Who else knows the system like you do?" I let the silence linger before replying. "Careful, Richard. Paranoia makes men weak." If he exhaled sharply, "If you think you can destroy me, you're mistaken. I built this company. I own the board. I own the press. I own everything." A small smile tugged at my lips. "And yet you're calling me in the middle of the night. Sounds like you own nothing but fear." The line went dead. Richard had made his mistake. He revealed his fear. And fear in business is blood in the water. The next morning, he tried to fight back in court, filing injunctions against the competitor firms I was tied to. He claimed intellectual theft, sabotage, breaches of contract. But his lawyers hadn't seen the clauses I had carefully hidden years ago. Each motion backfired, each attempt collapsing under its own weight. Judges dismissed his filings with disdain. Meanwhile, whispers spread beyond the boardroom. Employees, once too afraid to speak, began leaking stories to journalists. Tales of Richard's arrogance, his reckless decisions, his mistreatment of staff. The media had found a villain, and they tore into him with glee. Every article was another crack in his armor. Every headline another cut. Still, Richard fought. He tightened his grip on the few loyalists he had left, barking orders to salvage what remained. But salvage requires stability, and stability was the one thing he would never have again, because the final strike was already in motion. The competitors I had aligned with were no longer just small firms. They were united under my guidance, linked by contracts that ensured they grew while Hargrave shrank. Together, they began to encroach on his market territory, offering services with flawless precision. My services. Clients defected in waves. What began as hesitation turned into exodus, and Richard could do nothing but watch. He had betrayed me believing I was replaceable. Now, as he fought desperately to keep his empire from burning, he realized the truth. I wasn't just the only one who knew the trade secret. I was the trade secret, and I was about to bury him with it. The boardroom that had once rung with Richard Hargrave's commands now echoed with questions. The emergency motions, the investor letters, the frantic attempts at damage control. They all piled up like evidence against a man who had built his life on certainty. The media had found new prey, a CEO in freefall, stubbornly clutching a legacy as it unstitched itself. I watched it unfold not from a place of glee, but with a surgeon's detachment. This was the precise unmaking of a man who had thought himself invincible. Years of arrogance, years of trampling colleagues, had left him exposed to something he had never understood: the power of the people he dismissed. The final act began when Hargrave Industries called an extraordinary shareholders' meeting. Cameras were invited, statements were drafted. Richard strode in with the practiced posture of a man who intended to salvage his throne. He spoke of resilience, of restructuring, of new hires to stabilize, project synthesis. His words were polished, but in them lay the naked admission of failure. Investors, however, had already seen the alternatives. They had watched contracts redirect, profits migrate, and headlines swallow a man's reputation. The multinational client that had first left became an example cited in earnings calls. Competing firms, the ones I'd quietly fortified, presented performance numbers that were undeniable. Where Hargrave promised, they delivered. Where he wavered, they excelled. The vote was swift, a board once loyal to Richard pivoted to survival. They voted to remove him as CEO and install an interim committee to steer the company through crisis. Richard's face, usually a mask, flickered with something close to disbelief. In that instant, I understood how fragile power truly is when it is built on intimidation rather than competence. But legal battles lingered. Richard tried to claw back by suing the competitors, by alleging theft and conspiracy. His lawyers launched a last-ditch campaign to declare the contracts void, to freeze accounts, to halt the exodus. Yet every motion they filed encountered the clauses I'd sowed years ago. Precise, legal, seeds that overturned his claims and protected the clients who had trusted me. Judges, fed up with spectacle and cleverly drafted claims, rejected his appeals or dismissed them on procedural grounds. Then came the auditors. Independent reviews of project synthesis revealed the instability he could never stabilize without the missing variable. My variable. The truth became clean and incontrovertible in black and white reports. Hargrave Industries had been operating a critical system without full knowledge of its architecture. Shareholders read the reports. Regulators took notice. Penalties and fines followed, and the company's share price, already wounded, tumbled further. For Richard, the downfall was both professional and private. Former allies distanced themselves. Board members who had once praised him now publicly called for transparency. Stories of his mistreatment, once quietly whispered in corridors, were now catalogued with dates and names. His reputation, his real currency, had been drained. I received the message about his resignation in the middle of a meeting with a client. The room hummed with business talk. When my phone lit, I watched the tiny notification and felt the room tilt. The client looked up. "Everything all right?" they asked. "Everything," I said. It was enough. What followed wasn't a triumphal march. Revenge rarely is. There were quiet moments of reflection, calls to former colleagues who needed help finding work. Negotiations to ensure the competitors I'd helped didn't become new tyrants in the industry. I insisted on ethical clauses in every contract we signed, a small correction to a world that had been unkind to too many good people. Years later, Hargrave Industries survived, trimmed, cautious, humbled. It became a smaller player, run by committees and compliance officers rather than a single overpowering personality. The industry learned to value transparency and shared knowledge, and clients demanded redundancies so no single person could hold a company hostage again. As for me, I kept what I needed and let the rest go. I consulted, I taught, I wrote the missing pieces into open frameworks that made systems safer for everyone who used them. The trade secret that had been my leverage became, in part, a public safeguard, released carefully into the world so no one could weaponize ignorance again. Power shifted the way power always does. It concentrates, corrupts, and then disperses. I had been a steward and a sword. I'd taken what I needed to survive and to correct a wrong. In the end, I learned something harsher than victory. That true reckoning isn't about ruin alone. It's about rebuilding a fairer foundation so the next betrayal has nowhere to take root. Richard's empire had fallen, and the world was quieter for it. But the lesson remained loud. Never mistake a person's compliance for loyalty, and never assume you own what another has lived inside their mind.